Our speaker today, Dr. Katharina DOBS, is a young but remarkably influent scholar. She has been trained, she was trained at the Max Planck Institute, if I recall correctly, and she worked among the several postdocs. She worked at MIT with Nancy Kanwisher, that you might know people as being the woman who discovered the fusiform phase area and became sort of one of the leading figure of today's debate about the neural basis of phase processing.
Well, thank you so much for this kind introduction, Marco. I'm very happy to be here, and that you invited me and to represent the last part of this session now. Sorry that I had to postpone before, but I'm glad you're all still around. So thanks for having me to present and inviting me to present my work about a computational approach to understanding visual recognition in the human brain. As we all know, face recognition is crucial for our daily life, and people with face perception disorders, such as prosopagnostics, who cannot recognize faces, are severely impaired in their social lives. So what is the problem their vision needs to solve to recognize a face in this crowd? So when we look at this face here, for example, the 2D pattern of lights that's entering our eyes is processed through different processing stages until we come up with the abstract representation of the face, such as this is Anna. So how does face recognition work in humans? And what are the computations and representations at each processing stage? How are they built, and why do they arise? And while we don't have an answer to these questions yet, we've actually learned a lot about classic signatures of face processing in the past decades. So I want to present to you a few of the classic findings that we know about face perception. So starting with behavior of face processing signatures, there's some really classic work starting with Gorin et al. in 1975, who found that even newborns already show a preference for faces. They preferentially look at face-like patterns that are upright compared to inverted, and they seem to be attracted to faces. And there's also, for example, the classic face inversion effect. So the finding that our face processing system seems to be optimized for upright, but not so much for inverted faces. So when we look at these two inverted faces here, they look quite okay to us, right? They don't have anything bizarre except that they're upside down. But now when we rotate them, and these are the exact same images, you notice that there's something really off, right? And so that's just one of the classic effects showing that indeed there seems something optimized for us to process upright, not so much inverted faces. So the classic behavioral signatures associated with face processing, these are just a few examples. And now there's also more findings in terms of the neural system, or what's going on in the brain. And so one of these findings is there's face selectivity in the primate ventral pathway. And as Marco already said at the beginning, one of these really early findings by Nancy Kanwisher and others in 1996, using one of the first experiments using fMRI, so functional magnetic resonance imaging, was that they found that there's some voxels in the brain, some areas in the brain that seem to selectively respond when they present faces, so that's the F view, but not so much when you show subjects in the scanner objects, but they again responded a lot to faces, not so much to objects, and they seem to be really stimulated by faces and not respond to much else. And the same finding has been replicated several times. This is really powerful here by Zhao et al. Looking at face selective neurons directly in monkeys, where they do direct recordings from neurons in the inferior temporal cortex, and find that the really neurons that are tuned to faces, they respond really strongly to faces, but not much to anything else. Okay, so there seem to be voxels or neurons that respond selectively to faces compared to other visual categories. Another finding that we know is about the functional organization in the human visual system. And so what I'm referring to here is that it's not just that there seem to be an area that's selectively processing faces, but there even seem to be, areas responding to other parts, areas more processing objects or bodies or scenes. But importantly, these areas seem to be functionally segregated. And what do I mean by that is basically in lots of patient studies, what others have found is that if you have a lesion in your face processing area, you are impaired to recognize faces or to perceive faces, but your object recognition system might work totally fine. So these systems seem to be sort of independent from each other. And the same has been found for patients that have lesions in their object processing system that's more processing shapes and so on. They're impaired in recognizing objects, but their face perception system is still fine. And that has also been replicated using TMS, so transcranial magnetic stimulation, where you zap certain locations of your visual system, and you can also impair one task but not the other. So there seems to be a double dissociation, and this evidence suggests that there is a functional segregation between face and object processing in the human visual system. And just as a note here, I'm talking about their functional organization, not about their spatial organization. So not so much about why these areas are clustered or why they are in a certain location, but more the fact that they're functionally segregated from each other. And you can, if you have an impairment in one, you don't harm the other one, and vice versa. Although looking at the spatial segregation is also interesting and definitely related. Cool. So today I want to really go through these three sort of classic signatures of face perception behavior, face selectivity in the human visual cortex, and the functional organization in the human visual cortex, and ask, why does the face perception system show these properties that we know since such a long time? Do you have to build something specific about faces into the system, or can all of this just arise from experience with faces without building in any specific prior on how to build a face system? And those questions are hard to answer in humans because we cannot change our genes or radically alter people's experience during infancy, right? So today I will argue that we can ask these questions in machines, whether it's possible to get these signatures from experience alone, or whether you have to start with some face-specific priors on how to build a face system. And I will also argue that this approach can start to answer why questions about the mind and brain. So up to now, most of the work in cognitive science and neuroscience of face perception has been purely descriptive. So we simply describe the system and how it behaves, but we don't explain why it might have those properties and why it works that way. But I will argue today that the artificial visual systems enable us to do something new and exciting. We can ask why the system has those properties. Why do we have inversion effects or face selective cells? Or separate pathways in the brain for face and object recognition. And the idea is that to the extent that an artificial system that's optimized for face recognition without any built-in face-specific priors ends up having the same properties as the human face perception system, that suggests that the human face system has these properties because that's what any system optimized for face recognition will have, whether it's optimized over evolution, over development in brains, or optimized by machine learning algorithms in an artificial system. Okay, and why these ideas have been around for quite some time, there was one problem, which was basically that we had no means or no tools to test these ideas. And the reason was that there was basically no system available that was anywhere close to human level performance in object or face recognition. And this suddenly changed with the rise of convolutional networks, or CNNs, in computer science. So I'm just giving you a quick overview here. So in 2012, Krzyzewski et al. Developed AlexNet, which is a CNN optimized to classify images into object categories. And critically, these CNNs are image computable, meaning that they can be trained on natural images, like that image of the orange here. And this image then gets put through a cascade of operations, extracting features of the image, pulling those together, and eventually classifying the object category. So like the label orange here. And this particular organization, AlexNet, won the most important computer vision challenge at that time, and each following year, another CNN won the challenge until by 2015, CNNs achieved human-level accuracy in object categorization. And despite still being far from human level visual recognition, and I'm just mentioning a few important studies here on the bottom, CNNs are very useful in a big advance, not just for computer science or computer vision, but also for human cognitive neuroscience. So these computational models are actually inspired by the brain's visual processing hierarchy. And in the last few years, several dozens of papers have been published showing that there's a high similarity between the features extracted at the different layers of the CNN and the different processing stages in the human brain. And this is exciting because for the first time, we have image computable models of how human visual recognition might work in the brain, or in particular, how face recognition might work in the brain. Okay, so there's one more overview slide where I want to talk about how can CNNs actually contribute to our understanding, because what you might have encountered in this context, or what you might have thought about, is how can it help? How can it be helpful to replace one black box with another, right? How can these models help us to understand anything about the brain? And I just want to emphasize a few things that you can do with these models or these artificial systems that would be really hard, if not impossible, to do with the human brain. So one thing we can do is we can look at development. So we have full control over the learning stage. We can look at a randomly initialized model or fully trained model or any learning stage in between and try to understand how did it get there from the beginning, right? We also have full control over experience, so over the training diet. Means we can, for example, face deprive the system by showing it lots and lots of images, but just excluding all the faces. Or we can train it on faces and objects and so on, and we know exactly what sort of experience the model has had. And all of these approaches are data-driven, so they're large-scale data sets that we use, large-scale experiments, and they overcome lots of limitations that we have with current experimental setups, where basically there's only a limited amount of stimuli that you can show your subjects in the scanner in your experiments because of their attentional scale and how long they want to focus, basically. And then another good thing is that we have full access to the representations. So we can read out at any level in that system, from a single unit level to a population readout level. We can extract the activations at any of those stages, and we can even lesion the model. So lesion certain parts, certain units of the model, or even an entire layer to find out what is their involvement in the task? Are they causally involved in the task? And that's, you know, a big limitation that we have in cognitive neuroscience, where we just can't lesion certain parts to find out what it's doing, right? So yeah, I want to argue today that these models are very useful to test certain hypotheses about the human visual system in particular, and by comparing these two models, we can then go back and improve the models to see, or just, you know, the brain and the models, to improve the models and make them more brain-like. And by that, you know, learn from each other. All right, so let's get into the results. So I told you I'll talk about face perception behavior, face selectivity, and the functional organization in the human visual cortex, and ask in particular, why does the face perception system show these properties? Do you have to build something specific about faces into the system, or can all of this just arise without any face-specific prior, right? So we'll start about face perception behavior. And this is a project that I did together with Joanne Yuan, Julio Martinez, and Nancy Kenwisher at MIT. And the first questions we had here was, does human-like face perception behavior actually emerge spontaneously in networks optimized for face recognition? So would they be able to replicate or even, you know, achieve human-level performance in face recognition? And can that help us to understand why the human face perception system shows signatures such as the face inversion effect? So what we did, the idea was, we had a system that was trained on object categorization, so had no face-specific experience, and another network trained to discriminate faces. So what we manipulated here was whether the system had face-specific experience or not. Importantly, none of these models had anything face-specific built in there, right? There were random models that were either trained on one or the other. So the only thing that varied was the experience, but we didn't tell them anything about faces or what they looked like. There was no inductive bias or anything in those systems. All right, so how did we do this in detail? We used a VGG16 architecture, which is just a standard feed-forward CNN architecture that has been used a lot for object and face recognition, and also shown a good similarity with the primate visual system. And we first trained in the first network, trained it to categorize 423 object categories. So these were categories that we took from the ImageNet dataset. And we manually selected them to be prototypical objects. So we removed lots of animals and scene-like categories and so on. And then we took the same architecture and randomly initialized and trained this to recognize around 1,700 identities from the VGG phase 2 dataset. And importantly, so these two models were trained on very different goals, if you want, but importantly, the number of images were matched between the two training sets. So the amount of experience was identical. The only thing that differed was what kind of experience they had. And now we wanted to know, okay, how well can these models capture human face recognition performance? So how did we measure human face recognition performance? We ran a large-scale study on Amazon Mechanical Turk and simply asked subjects to choose which of two matching faces in the bottom here belong to the same identity as a target face, based on all combinations of 40 different identities. And we particularly choose 40 female identities that were similar age in all of the same race, so they were all white, in order to make the task rather difficult. So you couldn't use, simple cues such as skin color, gender, things like that, or age. And then this was a total of 1,560 combinations, and we collected 20 repetitions per combination. So when you have this task, what you get for human performance is a choice, right? They choose A or B, and you know which is right and which is wrong. So there's accuracy as an output. In the CNNs, we can simulate the same task by showing it the exact same images and then extracting the features from the last convolutional layer, for example, in this network. So you get a feature pattern vector for each of those images. And then we have you get this for the target and the two matches, and we simply compute the distance between those two vectors of the match and the target. And the idea is then that the CNN chooses the one that's closer to the target. Okay, so that's simulating the choice in the model. And now we want to know, okay, do CNNs show human-like face recognition performance? So on the y-axis here is the identity matching accuracy. And the gray bar that you can see here is our human performance. So human face recognition accuracy, you can see they were pretty good, around 88%, but they were not at ceiling. So the task was still not super easy to them. Now we want to know, okay, how do our objects or CNNs perform? And what we see is that the face CNN actually achieved almost the same accuracy as our human subjects, while the object CNN did not perform as well. Right? It's important to mention here that it is above chance level. Yeah, chance level would be 50% in this task, but the performance is much lower than the face CNN and much lower. It doesn't get anywhere near a human performance either. So face-trained CNNs closely match human face recognition accuracy on novel identities. So that's important. Like all the identities that we used in the experiment were novel to the CNN, and we also made sure that they were unfamiliar to the human subjects. But then, okay, that's looking at performance, overall performance. Okay, they can perform equally well, but do they represent these faces in the same way? That's what we wanted to find out next. So we asked this, do CNNs capture human face similarity behavior by taking these two models and seeing, do they represent the faces, in particular the distance between individual faces, do they represent them in a similar way? So we measured their perceptual similarity in a multi-arrangement task, where we asked subjects to arrange 80 face images that you can see here in a circle according to their perceived similarity. So faces that they perceive similar should be close to each other, and that they perceive dissimilar should be farther away. from each other. And then there's follow-up trials where they get only multiple items of subsets and have to arrange them in the same circle. And from that, you can infer the dissimilarity structure based on the distance information that you get from this 2D screen, basically. So the output of that task is a representational dissimilarity matrix, or an RDM, where each cell in this matrix represents the similarity between a pair of face images. So they could be very similar or very dissimilar to each other. From the CNN models, we can do the same thing by showing it the exact same images, extracting the features for each of those images, and then computing the distance, for example, by taking 1 minus Pearson correlation and putting those in a matrix. So now for the same images, we get the same distance matrix, but what we want to know, and that's what representational similarity analysis, or RSA, is doing, is how close are they to each other? How similar is the model representational space to the behavioral representational space? So we compute the Spearman rank correlation between those two, and that tells us something about how similar those faces are represented in these two systems. Okay, so to find out, we had our face and our object trained model. And on the y-axis now, I'm showing you the RSA correlation, so the correlation between the model representational space and the behavior, human behavior. And the gray bar here is the noise ceiling, so that's basically the maximum correlation you can achieve, given that there is variability across subjects. So we'll start by looking at the object CNN. On the x-axis here, these are the different layers in the model, because we thought it would be interesting to see how it is developed, starting from early layers in the network to late layers in the network. Okay, and what we see is that there's a slight increase in correlation, but it doesn't get really high, and it definitely doesn't get close to the human perceptual space and the noise ceiling. When we do the same thing for the face CNN, we see that there's a nice increase in correlation, and in particular, the last layers of the network seem to correspond or seem to match the human similarity space pretty well. So face-trained CNNs capture human face behavior well and outperform object-trained CNNs. Okay, but now let's get a bit more qualitatively and look at those, classic effects that we know about since a long time. And we wanted to know, okay, do CNNs show a face inversion effect? And if yes, based on what type of experience? So we asked subjects to perform a target matching task on the same stimuli, but now the inverted female identities. There were again around 1,200 subjects on the MEMS and Mechanical Turk. And we replicated the face inversion effect that has been shown many, many times. So in behavior, what you see is this was the performance on the upright faces for humans. This is now the performance on the inverted faces. So there's a strong decrement in performance when you do that task on inverted faces. Now we wanted to see, okay, do our models show that as well? And the face CNN indeed does. So that's our face trained model, and we see there's a huge drop in performance for the inverted faces. When we look at the object network, there's no difference at all. It doesn't care whether you presented upright or inverted faces, performance is almost identical. So there's a face inversion effect in face trained, but not in object trained CNNs. Cool. We wanted to look at another effect. We were interested in the other race effect. So the fact that we usually have a harder time discriminating faces that are from a race that we didn't grow up with, or we didn't have lots of experience with in our childhood. And so in order to test this, we used another stimulus set where we used Asian female identities. So they were the same age, they were also female, but there were Asian faces. And in particular, our subjects were all based in the US and were all mainly white subjects. So we had them perform the same task. And what we found is that there was indeed another race effect, basically meaning that the performance in the target matching test was much lower on the Asian female identities than on the white female identities. How about our CNNs? In the face CNN, we see the same thing. So again, performance is lower on the Asian identities than on the white identities. And it's important here to give to tell you that these data sets that the models are trained on, the face identity data sets, they also have a strong bias that they're typically white identities and not so many identities from other races. So they have different they definitely have different genders and ages and so on, but not so much variation in race. They're overwhelmingly white. When we look at the object CNN, we again find that there's no difference. And that's interesting in particular because the object CNN, their images contain faces and they have the same biases, but it seems like it doesn't really matter for the performance here. So the face trained but not the object trained CNN show another race effect. Okay, so the questions that we asked at the beginning of this project was, does human live face perception emerge spontaneously in networks optimized for face recognition? We find that only face-trained CNNs approached human-level face recognition and showed these classic face signatures that we see in human face behavior. And we think these results can also tell us something about why the human face perception systems show these signatures, such as the face inversion effect, because these classic face signatures in humans may actually result from an optimization for face recognition. So it seems like if you have a system, whatever system it is, be it artificial, be it the human brain, you're trained to recognize faces, these sort of classic signatures emerge as a byproduct of the optimization to recognize faces. Cool. There's more ongoing work. I mean, there's many follow-up questions that we have. One of them is the question: do you really need training on the fine-grained discrimination, or is the exposure, the mere exposure to faces actually sufficient? So what we want to do is have a network that's basically just has one class that's called faces, and you put all the faces in there. Would that be sufficient to get human performance, or does the system really have to be trained to discriminate every single identity from each other? And yeah, there are many more, but yeah, that's a work on face perception behavior. So when we asked, what sort of experience is required in order to match human behavior, and do these models, can they do it at all without any face specific bias? We find that yes, indeed, the face trained CNNs do match human behavior in several aspects, while the object trained CNNs do not. Okay, and by that we'll go to the second part, and we look at face selectivity, so on a neural level, in the human visual cortex. And so just to introduce that debate a little bit, the debate about nature versus nurture in face selectivity is a long list, and I'm just giving you two examples here. So on the experience side, there's studies like the one by Michael Caro and others who showed that face-deprived monkeys, so monkeys that were grown up without seeing faces, so the people that raised them were always wearing masks and you couldn't see their faces, do not develop face selective regions in their visual system. Okay, so it's a strong argument for face experience seem to be necessary for face selectivity to evolve or to develop. On the innate side, there's many findings, one of them, for example, being by Heather Kozakowski et al., who found using fMRI that even like very young babies with a few months old already show face selective areas in their ventral visual pathway, suggesting that either these things develop very quickly or they're sort of already there when they're born. They're sort of innate, right? So that's the debate, and there are many more arguments on one or the other side. But what we thought is, okay, let's use CNNs to address this debate, or to look at this from another angle, and in particular ask this question: does neuroface selectivity require visual experience? And I would just want to quickly mention a paper here that was submitted as a preprint on bioRxiv in 2019 by Beck et al. And what they found was really puzzling to many people in face perception research. So they basically found that this spontaneous generation of face recognition in untrained deep neural networks. So what does it mean? It means they use this AlexNet network that I've introduced at the beginning, and it was randomly initialized, right? It hadn't seen anything. It wasn't trained on anything. They took the last convolutional layer of this network and showed it images of different categories, including faces, and then just measured whether there were units in this last convolutional layer that would selectively respond to faces compared to anything else. And indeed, they found them. So there were indeed units in this artificial system that hadn't seen anything, that selectively responded to faces here compared to any of these other visual categories. So around 3% of all units were face selective in a CNN without any visual experience, right? And that was quite puzzling, and people get excited about this also on Twitter. And so we thought, okay, let's look at this a bit more. And this is again a project with Joanne Yuan and Nancy Canbrisher. So what we wanted to understand is, okay, can face selectivity really arise in CNNs without anything built in for faces per se? So no, face template or anything like that. And how does experience really affect these face selective units? So we took the object CNN that I showed you before, the face trained CNN, and then we added, for these two, we manipulated whether they had face specific experience or not, but then we added a third one, namely the random untrained CNN. So same architecture, but hadn't been trained on anything. So basically the manipulation here was with or without any visual experience, right? And we thought this was a particularly interesting case because it sort of suggested there's a third alternative. It's neither nature nor nurture, but face activity can actually arise spontaneously from the random initial wiring in hierarchical neural networks, okay, without anything else. And so we wanted to look at this a bit further. So we measured face selectivity in CNNs using a classic localizer data set that has been used in particular in fMRI many times. So this data set here is from Stigliani et al. In 2015, and it contains images of faces, characters, bodies, houses, cars, and scrambled images. And the nice thing about this data set is it's sort of perfectly controlled. So any response that you get that is higher to faces cannot be explained by any low-level confounds, such as faces are more similar to each other than other categories, or contrast or color or anything like that. And so we showed these images to the random CNN, the object CNN, and the face CNN, and then basically measured in the last convolutional layer of these networks, are there any filters that respond more to faces than to anything else? Okay, so, and then we count them, how many selective filter would we find in these networks. And we used a pretty conservative P criterion that you can see here to define what is significant, what is a significant higher response to faces than to anything else. And indeed, we replicated their findings, the finding by Beck et al., and we found that 28 of the 512, so 5% of the filters, significantly responded more to faces than to anything else. In the object-trained CNN, this number increased. Here we found 82, so 16% of the filters were face selective. So even training on objects, seem to increase your likelihood that you have face selective filters, probably because faces are also useful information to categorize different objects from each other. So if you know these data sets, some of the object categories contain faces, in particular, like if you have category like a wig or a bow tie or something. So faces is useful information here, so it's useful for them to detect faces. And then we looked at the face CNN, and here 60% of all the filters were face selective and responded more to faces than to anything else, which was not too surprising. But then this is only saying, okay, which filters make the threshold, right? For which filters do they respond significantly, somehow constantly more to face than to anything else? But you can do one more thing that we do in literature quite often, which is quantifying that selectivity by computing a selectivity index. So you basically take the response to the faces minus the response to all the other categories, divided by the sum of them, and what you get is an index between -1 and 1, where 1 is maximum selectivity. It means you respond to faces, and 0 to anything else. -1 would be the opposite, and 0 means you respond equally to both. So we quantified those significantly selective filters in terms of the selectivity, and we found that selectivity in random CNN was actually pretty low, meaning that they constantly responded more to faces than to the other categories, but it seems like the overall difference was pretty small. For the object CNN, the difference got much bigger. It was 0.45. And for the face CNN, we found the maximum selectivity. Interestingly, not too far from the object CNN, suggesting that, you know, just purely detecting faces is something that the object CNN can already do pretty well. So face selective units are actually found in all CNNs. We thought it was interesting, but then we wanted to understand them a little further. And one thing you can do in these models that's quite fun to do is you can visualize those face selective units or filters. So that's what we did. We took the 5 most face selective filters in each of these models and said, okay, let's visualize what their optimal input is. So what you do is you start with a random pixel pattern. You show it to the system. You say, this is the filter I'm interested in. And then you modify this image until it maximizes the response in your filter. So you know exactly what drives this filter. What does it like? What features does it like? When you do that in the random CNN, that's what you get. So these are the 5 most face selective units. And this is the selectivity index here on top of them for them. And you can see it looks pretty random, right? There's not really anything detectable, at least for us. So somehow, you know, these random patterns seem to like faces more than anything else, but it's nothing that is interpretable for us, which is maybe not so surprising given that these networks haven't been trained on anything. And we do the same thing for the object CNN. We see more structure, more shape-like features, but it's still hard to figure out. I mean, this could be a nose, or this could be 2 eyes on top of something, and it's maybe roundish features, but it still doesn't resemble a face. We do the same thing for the face CNN. That's, you know, when we get the really face-like features. So we really see they like eyes, nose, and mouth, and they even have them in the correct configuration, right? They sort of have a holistic representation of a face in a way that the eyes are on top of the nose and the mouth, and so on. And the interesting thing is, you know, these have almost equal selectivity when you look at the indices, but they definitely respond very differently to. They prefer different features, right? So all these face selective units differ in the features they preferentially respond to. So we wondered, how useful are these face selective units to discriminate identities? You know, would they all be equally useful to discriminate different identities from each other? And in order to test that, what we did is we had 100 held-out identities. So these were novel identities none of the networks had ever seen before or been trained, 10 images each. And we showed them to the random untrained CNN and extracted the features from these 28 most face selective filters or significantly selective filters for each of those images. And then we also showed them to the object and the face CNN, and again used the 28 most face selective filters. So in each of the cases, we used the same amount of face selective filters, always the 28, which was limited by the random CNN, which had the fewest. And then we trained a linear classifier, so in this case, a support vector machine, to ask, okay, you know, how well can you discriminate these identities based on the features from these face selective units that you get from all the different models? So that's the decoding accuracy here. 100% is maximum, and 1% would be chance because there were 100 different identities. What we find is that the units from the random network are actually pretty good. Like they're close to 50%. Given that this network hasn't been trained on anything, it means there's really, yeah, some structure in those images that you can use to discriminate identities. Oops, sorry. Go back here. Then we look at the object CNN, and here we see, okay, interesting, training on objects seem to increase the performance. You can now better discriminate identities. And when you use the 28 most selective filters from the face CNN, now you can maximally discriminate identities above 90%. Okay, so despite them all being face selective filters, some of them are more useful to discriminate different identities than others. So the representation of the face selective units in the face CNN were most useful to discriminate identities. And then we also wanted to know, do they capture human face behavior? So we also correlated them with the data from the human behavior that I showed you in the part before, all the 3 models, but only using the face selective filters in these networks. And that's again the correlation, the representational similarity analysis correlation here. And what we find is that there's a pretty low correlation. So the way the random network represents these faces is very dissimilar from what humans do. The correlation increases for the object, for the filters, face selective filters in the object trained system, and they're maximally using the face system. So the representation of face selective units in the face CNN best capture human face perception behavior. Okay, so yeah, these are these you know, the initial results we had when looking at this. So we definitely found that face selectivity arises in CNNs without anything built in for faces per se. So visual experience even seems not necessary for face selectivity to emerge without in CNNs without face-specific bias. However, we found that the more face experience, the more human-like behavior and performance these face selective units show. And we thought that finding is in particular interesting when you look at those results, whether you find face selective areas in babies, because you could ask, maybe the face selective areas that we find in babies are qualitatively different from the face selective areas in adults. So maybe those voxels pass the threshold to respond more to faces than to anything else, but maybe, you know, they're still not as useful to discriminate faces from each other. They're still in some sort of a developmental stage. So yeah, and what we also want to do is now look at how these face selective units in untrained networks develop over the course of training. So if you have a random network with and you have those face selective units and you start to train the network, are those the units that will actually be relevant to discriminate faces also later in a fully trained network? And that would sort of suggest that there's, you know, that it's somehow using this like initial bias that some units prefer faces from very early on and builds up on that. Yeah. So when we looked at face selectivity in human visual cortex, we again sort of found it in the object CNN, but they didn't match human behavior or criteria that we cited more details, as well as the face trained CNN. Cool. Okay. So now we're getting to the last part, where we're looking at the functional organization in human visual cortex. And so we basically, you know, want to go one step further here in this project and ask about not just faces, but also the distinction of faces from objects, right? And this project was sort of, you know, my major project in the last few years, together with Julio Martinez and Alex Kell at Columbia, and then Nancy Kenwisher, and we really wanted to understand, you know, what is it? Why are these systems segregated in the visual system? Why do we have these face processing areas in the system, and why are they segregated from everything else? And so the first question we wanted to ask is, or we had in mind, was, do face and object tasks require distinct representation? So the idea was basically to use these models like ideal observer models, but for natural tasks, and ask, do the representations for one task transfer to the other? And from a computational point of view, is there even a requirement to segregate face processing, or will it be sufficient to use generic object-trained representations? So is there, and then in the next step, we asked, okay, and what happens now if we take a network and train it on both tasks, faces and objects? Is there a set of representations that this model can learn that transfers between the two tasks? So, or would we replicate this double dissociation in systems that are trained on faces and objects? All right. So what we did is we took these two models that you're familiar with now, the face and object trained CNN, and first asked, okay, do they require distinct computations to do each other tasks, to categorize objects or to discriminate or recognize faces? And what we did to test this is we had these 100 header identities that I showed you before, 10 images each. We showed them to the face CNN and we extracted the features for each of those images. But then we also had 100 held-out object categories. So these were objects that we took from the Things database. So they were completely novel objects, the object CNN had never seen before or not been trained on, and so on. And then we also showed the face images to the object-trained CNN and the object images to the face-trained CNN, and again, extracting those activations. And so the idea was now, okay, we have the activations for faces and objects from the face trained to object trained CNN. Would we find this double dissociation, right? For the face decoding, you can already see the results from what I presented you before. So obviously what we found was that decoding accuracy from the face CNN is really good, close to ceiling, whereas the object CNN was above chance level, but much lower in performance. But now the question is, would we find the same thing for object decoding? And indeed we did. So here, the face CNN was not useful to discriminate different objects from each other, while the object CNN, the features from the object CNN were much more useful. So object-trained networks do not do well on the face task and vice versa. And that sort of is the same double dissociation that we see in the brain, where one system can do faces, and if you harm it, it harms one task but not the other in those two systems. So it sort of makes sense. It seems this is suggesting that they rely on distinct features, on distinct representations. Okay, but then we wanted to know what happens if we train a CNN on both tasks. So we took the same architecture, but now we trained the system on faces and objects. So this is, we call it a dual task CNN. So we just concatenate the face and the object classes into one large classification layer here and train it on mixed batches of faces and objects. And so optimize it on both tasks, but importantly, there's no built-in task-specific bias. So we know that these classes here are faces and these classes are objects. The network has no idea about that, right? It treats them all as one big task. It doesn't know anything about faces or objects. So we wanted to know, first thing we wanted to understand is that does the system learn both tasks well? So we took these two models, and this is the test performance here that we get on the independent set of images of the classes the models have been trained for the face and the object network. Now the question is, what about our dual task network? How would that perform? When we look at the performance, what we see, and in particular, would it be able to do both tasks as well, given that it now has to share these two tasks in the same system, right? Here we took one system trained on one task or the other task. Now we take the same system, train it on both tasks. Would it be able to perform as well as the single networks? And we found that yes, it does. It can learn both tasks almost as well as the single networks trained on the same tasks. So face and object tasks can be performed well in one system. So we're a bit puzzled by this and thought, okay, so far with our hypothesis, so maybe one system can actually do both tasks, and there's no reason why these things have to be segregated, at least from a computational point of view. But then there's an alternative hypothesis or alternative explanation, which is, what if this network spontaneously discovered task segregation? So what if you look inside the network, what you find is that some units start to specialize to process faces and other units start to specialize to process objects. So we wanted to find out, of course. And that's, another thing that we can do in these networks is we can look inside, and not just that, we can perform lesion experiments to really find out, what is the role of each of those units in the system. So we took our dual task network and dropped every single filter in the last convolutional layer. So we sort of lesion the filters, set their output to 0, and then show it batches of face images. And we compute the loss, so we compute the performance at the output of the network. And the idea is, if a filter is relevant to discriminate faces and you lesion it, then the loss should increase, right? Your performance should go down. If it's not relevant for the task, then dropping it shouldn't matter. And when you do this for all the filters in the network, you get a ranking. So you find the top 20% filters that showed the biggest increase in loss when you drop them. And now what we then did is we lesioned all of those top 20% filters all together, ranked by this face sorting, and tested them on an independent set of face on face categories and object categories to find out, first of all, does it generalize to an independent data set? And second of all, does the importance for the face task, is it selective for the face task? So if you drop those 20% of the filters, would you only harm the face task, or would you also harm the object task? And that's what we found. So we found that when you lesion those 20% of the filters that have been identified using this lesioning analysis here, we find that the performance of the face task goes really down, whereas the performance of the object task is almost not impaired. And we did the same thing, dropping each filter but showing it faces of object images, and ranked the filters by how important they were for performance on object categories. And when we lesion the top 20% filters ranked by the object sorting, we get the exact opposite. So again, now we impair the object task, but we don't impair the face task. Not as much, definitely. So there's evidence for functional specialization of face and object processing in one system. So we see that double dissociation, just like we've seen with patients in the human brain, in the system that we trained on faces and objects, although it had no idea, about faces and objects. And then we wondered, okay, but we took one layer now, right? We took the last convolutional layer, but at which processing stage does this domain specificity, does this functional segregation arise? Particularly, we know from the human visual system that functional specialization for faces is not there, or at least that's what the evidence shows so far, not there for the early visual processing stages, where we assume that the features are shared between all the different tasks, but then after some mid-level processing stage, that's when units and features start to specialize for faces and for other things. So we came up with the combined segregation index, which is basically just the segregation that tells you how selective is it dropping the face units, how selectively is it harming the face, not the object task, and then combining that with how selective is dropping the object units, the object, not the face task. The average of those two is the segregation index. One is maximum again. We do this for every single layer in the network. This and compute the segregation index. And that's what I'm showing you now here. So what you see is that the segregation is very low in the early stages of the network and then constantly increases and is maximum at the latest stage in the system. And just to visualize this a bit more to you, what that means is we can look at layer conv9 now here and visualize some of these object and face selective filters that we've identified. And when you look at the object filters, you see that they, they sort of start to like shape features. It's not really, they're pretty generic, right? When you look at the face filters in this network, they that's when you start to see a nose or an eye or some sort of local features, but the receptive fields are still rather small in these layers. When you go in the last convolutional layer now, the receptive fields get bigger, and you see that the object filters, again, some generic face object features that you start to like, whereas the face filters really develop within that system to preferentially respond to faces and face-like features. So segregation of face and object processing spontaneously emerges after some mid-level processing stages, like in the human visual system. Okay, and this is the last quick analysis I want to show you, where we looked at the learned representation of spaces and whether they're also similar to human perceptual behavior. So we did that multi-arrangement task I showed you before, but now we did it on faces, but also on objects. And this is now here the RSA correlation when we look at face behavior for the faces and the object CNN. You already know that, but now the question was, how does our dual task CNN perform? And what we find is that it matches the face CNN and achieves the similar human-like performance on face behavior. But now the cool thing is we can also look at object behavior, and here we find that it also matches human behavior on the objects, following now the object CNN, versus the face CNN cannot explain that behavior. So it seems that the dual task network captures human behavior in face and object tasks. So do face and object tasks require distinct representations? We find that yes, the representations are actually suboptimal for the other tasks, giving us a potential explanation for why they need to be in distinct systems. But when we then ask, can the same functional organization actually arise in CNNs trained on faces and objects, we find that the dual task network spontaneously segregates face and object tasks, similar to the visual cortex. And so, yeah, there are many questions following this work. What about faces makes them require facial specialization or specialization? And which tasks generally segregate based on human visual input? So here we trained these models quite arbitrary on 50% faces, 50% objects. But what I would love to do is better match the human visual input during development by using data sets, for example, like the CKIM data set, where parents agree to put their kids' head cams make them wear head cams on the forehead, and capture hours of videos of the visual experience from babies till 1 or 2 years old, and see if we take that visual experience, train a network on that, what kind of specializations would we see, and would they come out similarly as what we find in the visual system. Okay, so functional organization human visual cortex, we found that the dual task CNN seems to replicate that organizational feature that we see in the visual system by just training them on faces and objects. Yeah, with that, I'd like to conclude that we can get a system with all these signatures that we know from face studies from the last decades, from visual experience with faces alone, without any specific prior on how to build a face system. And I think that also helps us to address the question, or gets us closer to the question, why do we have these signatures? Because the functional properties and organization of the face perception system may reflect a computational optimization for the problem of face perception. And I want to end this with a quote from Marr in 1982, who said, "The nature of computations that underlie perception depends more upon the computational problem than on the particular hardware in which the solutions are implemented." So suggesting that the nature of the task itself is telling us a lot about what the brain will do to solve it. And yeah, I think that's what we can use these models for, and that's what I'm pretty excited about, not just for face perception, but for other aspects of the brain. Yeah, with that, I'd like to thank my collaborators and funders and you for your attention, and I'm